Hello, welcome to the meeting, Tenen, an ongoing series on the work of Stan Tenen. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our usual cast of characters: Daniel Gill, Lavana Tenen, Michael Andron, and Edel Packer. So today we're going to talk about a subject that Stan spent a lot of time researching, having to do with the relationship to the geometry of the hand model and things found in nature, especially in terms of flocking and swarming. But we want to also look at the idea of the Minyan and how that fits into this whole idea. And so I'm going to play a clip now from a video. It's on our website, meruvideo.com. The second episode of the video attachments to the alphabet that changed the world. So let's play the clip and then we'll talk about that.
The point of this? Well, if everyone can make the same gestures for the same feelings, then there's a wonderful quotation that comes into view, which we use everywhere. It's near the end of the book, and it's the description of what a minyan is supposed to do. You need at least 10 to form the minyan, and it turns out that the number 10 is significant because it's the first group that can form a school or a swarm or a flock. And there's information on flocking, schooling, and swarming in animals and birds and fish and ants, which shows that the flock comes together with 10 individuals, which is the minimum. If you get less than that, you don't get a full flock. It doesn't function properly. So that's a threshold. And it's a threshold for what? Well, a flock has emergent qualities. The individual animal does its own thing, but all together follow a pattern that unifies them and takes them to their food and whatever. And each bird in a flock has a slightly different angle of attack and slightly different aerodynamics. So while they're all the same, they're also all individuals, but they're all following the same gestures. So we put 10 people together who care about each other, whose feelings are open to each other. If there's ego involved, it becomes a kind of stiffness and rigidity. There's no flow of feelings. But if the 10 individuals, as is described in the quote, the source of the requirement is the love and connection with prayer, is the mystical concept of the minyan of 10 worships in a synagogue as one body, symbolizing the spheros of the bodily parts of the Shekinah, and eventually Messiah. The idea is that when 10 come together, and they're all spiritually and mentally full, whole, and all sound and caring, and they care for each other as if they're one body, then there's an emergence of a higher consciousness.
The example that Stan uses in terms of, and by the way, if you look carefully in that one clip of the dancers, you would have seen Adele hiding in the back of her group there. That is her, what is the name of your group, Adele?
The piece was called Etude 22, Meditation on the Alphabet. And the group was just a group
Just the group.
Community dancers that got together to learn this piece of choreography.
And it was such a great example, something that we never would have been able to see unless you hadn't done that, of this whole concept. But the reason I played it was to get the idea again of Stan's use of this idea of flocking and swarming. One animal by itself, one bird, one fish, is an individual, but as a group. And does this idea of 10, does anybody have any other information about that in terms of why 10, and not?
I know what was going on with the particular research that he was mentioning, that this was a period of time when people, I believe at Princeton, the fellow's name was, the last name of the researcher, the primary researcher's last name was Couzin, Couzin, and you can find a lot of it online. He was doing research as to how is it that fish, school together, that birds flock together. When you see them looking incredibly coordinated. And what he discovered was that there's like three phases of the motion. If there's and they start to relate to each other and become interrelated at about 10. It's a point that doesn't that Kuzin himself doesn't bring out, but if you actually look at the data, you notice that there appears to be a phase change in the way that these creatures are moving, either not in coordination with each other or in coordination with each other at around 10. And they've done a lot of research since in terms of what these creatures are evaluating. Basically I don't need to go into it. And that what appears to happen is, at least with some of them, is that there's first random motion, and then they tend to form a ring and then move off, which is very similar to the spiral and spiral vortex that creates the hand model. That is a really low res explanation of the relationship that Stanley explored, both in this paper, and if there's material in our book itself which goes into it in more organized detail.
What he had talked about is 10 people, in a room with love for each other,
Mhm.
with a common idea or goal, perhaps, and then perhaps utilizing the hand gestures in synchronicity to accomplish some.
Yeah, the idea is that resonance. The idea is 10 as a demarcation for a phase change. I think we've discussed it previously also that mathematically there is a difference between dealing with geometrical figures below 10 dimensions and above 10 dimensions. I think we dealt with this before. You can find it out in our book, but it's there in the math. There's something that happens at, 10 somethings, 10 whatevers. And so, of course, for somebody who's drawn to anomalies that stand out, okay, 10 here, 10 there, 10 there, 10 in a Minyan. What does this mean? So this was definitely something that we explored.
Lavana, wasn't there an experiment with a cube and putting spheres inside the cube? And at the point when you had 10 spheres in the cube, the spaces between the cubes were either less or more. So the point seemed to be that at some point the group is greater than the individual pieces when you hit 10. Something kind of magical happens. Can you remember and articulate that?
The first part of what you were saying relates to what I was trying to describe with the math, and it has to do with it's not just a cube and just spheres, because we're talking math, so we're talking dimensionality in a mathematical sense. And the math has been worked out. It's there, whereby if you're trying to pack as many spheres within a cubical figure as you possibly can, what is the status of the empty space that's in the middle that has to be in the middle of that cube? Because yeah, and what happens at 10 dimensions is all of a sudden that empty space becomes larger than its enclosing cube. And it makes no intuitive sense to us. I get that, but that's what the math says, which
I
says,
think it gets larger than the individual sphere.
oh, well, it's always that, but no, it's larger than the enclosing cube. And
Okay,
that's the phase change. Because basically the empty
okay,
space that's inside all of a sudden is bigger than what binds than its supposed boundary. And that's something to think about. There's a diagram in the book which makes it kind of clear. But if you think in terms of 10 people in a minyan, having enough to have that resonance to perhaps make one's prayers or the prayers of the minyan reach farther than otherwise. I don't know really how to express it, but change dimension, change resonance. Um, Again, there was so much more to explore on this, but it gives some sense as to what as to why 10 were were I don't know, designated, noticed, whatever you want to say. There are traditional explanations for why there are 10, why a minyan requires 10. But this is like something different that also points to it.
Daniel, did you have a comment?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's it's kind of like the TARDIS, in Doctor Who. It's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. It's I mean, in a kind of philosophical way, when your life includes other people, then you are, you're quite literally bigger on the inside than you are on the outside. And it's also, I mean, again, not not to be political, but it seems that this whole concept that you care about others, as if they're really yourself, you care about their physical existence, seems antithetical to the economic system that most of the world finds itself in now, by quite a bit, like just a completely opposites, and so that's interesting. Just interesting to point out that the world that we're most usually involved with is to some degree antithetical to real spirit, or the partaking of spirituality, or of an inner life of spirituality.
It's just interesting how this came about in who knows when in ancient Judaism, where to get together as a prayer group, that they determined that that was essential or important. And at some point, and in some places, is this correct that you won't even have a prayer group unless you have 10? I mean, it's like a solid requirement, at least 10, not the exact number, but less than 10 isn't enough. Is that true? Michael, do you?
Well, it probably dates back, at least a lot of people do, to Sodom and Gomorrah, when Abraham was praying to God not to destroy, because he didn't want Lot to be killed, to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And he said, if there were 50 righteous people there, would you destroy it? And God said, no. And so he began to bargain in very Jewish fashion. Okay, if we can get away with 50, how about 40? How about 30? When he got down to 10, God said, that's it. And that's probably an origin for somehow uniting the energy of 10 people in prayer to reach as high as it can go to the chairman of the board. And
it must have occurred after the diaspora, where Jews were spread all over. Obviously when they were all together, it wasn't an issue, but then at some point Jews were spread during the Roman times, especially, and in the first millennium, all over the mostly Europe and the Middle East, where they had these little communities. And so, if they were fortunate to have a rabbi, some was it a Talmudic edict, or I'm just curious.
Eventually it was, yeah.
Yeah, it must have
Eventually
been.
that became part of the Jewish canonical law,
Right.
that was how you did it. So you could not say Kaddish, for example, or Baruch Hu, which is a median point in the morning service, out loud. You said it to yourself. You said something quietly to yourself, but to say it as part of a group required that quorum,
Mhm.
and Minyan simply means counting. It's a counting.
People may not know that basically before the Common Era, the kind of prayer that and services that you see in a synagogue today did not exist.
Right.
So
Well, you had sacrifices, and so
but
different
it's not
things happened.
different.
It was,
A lot of stuff happened, but it's not like people standing around saying prayers together, reading the Torah,
Right.
the whole
Right.
kind
that
of
was
thing.
the priestly era, where they had the sacrifices, like,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that basically stopped, when the Romans took over finally, and the
Spread
temple
everybody
was
out.
destroyed,
Yeah.
and so you have to do something else. So this is what was done.
Well,
So,
there are synagogues where presumably they did communal services dating back to the Second Temple period. There are ruins of them, so it's not so clear. The Anshe Knesset Hagadola, the men of the Great Assembly, made the Shmona Esrei. You can learn about it in the Talmudic tractate of Megillah, where they talk about how however many of them there were, made the Shmona Esrei, whatever that means, and they made it to be some sort of prophetic vehicle. So I think they predate the destruction. So it's not far from the destruction of the Second Temple, but it's not. It definitely was, like the prayer service, and especially the Shmona Esrei, which is the prayer service really. Like it comes from a time when the temple was still standing, albeit maybe not long before. So, and again, I visited there's a bunch of ruins of these old synagogues. They're from the Roman period, but they predate the destruction. At least a couple of them. So it's right around that time. But
Daniel,
after the destruction, there was still a sizable group of Jews living in that land, and in Israel, sizable minority, even a majority of people living there were Jews for quite some time, but they weren't as together. And we had the Sanhedrin in Sipori I think it's after the destruction, definitely after the destruction. So it's complicated. Yeah, I'm not sure when exactly. Someone would have to do some research.
Daniel was referring to what's called the 13 benedictions. It's a prayer that's done by Orthodox Jews 3 times a day, Shemona Esrei. It's a vital part of the service. Let's get back to Stan's perspective on all this. Did you have another comment, Lavon?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about 10 persons in a minyan, and what I'm wondering is, it occurs to me that perhaps there were, I'm sure that there were holy people who were very, very sensitive, who were praying together, and wow, if they were praying together, did they notice a difference at 10? And that's something that I think about, because
Interesting.
it seems to me that if you're going to fulfill that that quote that was in the video that we just saw at the beginning, that people get together, and it's necessary that you love one's fellow, in order to act in unity. Well, that kind of a group of that kind of sensitive people and sensitive to each other would have been able to feel that difference, I would think. And there's no reason why that wouldn't have happened way, way, way back when these practices were first being felt out. And you know, I mean, that's just a guess on my
Yeah, it's
part.
hard to know. There's no really documentation on that. Oh, go ahead, Michael.
In the last 2 weeks, we've actually done an experiment which speaks to this. As I've mentioned on a few occasions, I have developed a healing circle, a healing minyan that we meet about once a week with people on the East Coast, here on the West Coast, and in Israel, all at the same time, all with the same specific meditation to get them all tuned into one another. Well, I came across this wonderful lady who has been on her own doing a certain kind of research with healers. She has built a Faraday cage inside her house. Faraday cage is a screened in small room which screens out radio signals and a lot of ambient electromagnetic noise in the environment, so that healers who get tuned in to a person, even remote, even from far away, can send their energy to that person. And these are frequencies, they're known as ELF or scalar waves, extremely low frequency magnetic fields. And these scalar waves, she has inside this Faraday cage antennae that are able to pick up in that range of 0 to 10 cycles a second. And so my initial experiment with her, that actually they recorded this, and you can see waveforms, actually see the waveforms and then do spectrographic readings on them to get frequencies and amplitudes and all that sort of thing. And what we did, one of my first experiments that I suggested we try was, I had already worked on her remote, and it picked up the field as I started sending it. And you could actually record it and measure it. I said, okay, let's try it with the group. Let's try it with 5 people trying to power pack me. In other words, a mini minyan, as it were. And then let's try it with 10 or more. And the jump that you can see on the waveform indicated that it was a measurable thing. In this ELF range, which is if you hollowed out the earth and you rang it like a bell, you'd end up with just under 8 cycles a second. It's known as the Schumann resonance. And this was something that healers seem to tune into. In a researcher that I had worked with, Dr. Puharich, had studied healers all over the world and discovered that they all started out by going into an 8 hertz state, a brain wave, and that and then the intent that they had, their intention was like, if you imagine that as a radio broadcast from the studio at a radio station, and then the person at the microphone started talking, his words went out like they were hanging on that 8 hertz carrier wave. And this is what we were trying to measure and actually successfully did. So it's not unusual to think that someone would be able to feel that quantum shift. And it's in the quantum world. It's not in the hard physical world. It's in the quantum world where whatever the intention comes in at, these scalar waves are all able to blend and to organize. You had stopped that videotape right before the end, Bill, where he's got this wonderful little thing with 10 particles or atoms or molecules, I forget what it is, and they all kind of organize and dance around that Bose-Einstein condensate and all kind of go and shoot up the middle. That's the goal of our healing circle.
Wow.
Yeah.
We actually outlined a potential experiment that sounds really like what you actually did.
Yeah.
Back in, like 2013 or something, like 10 years ago. And we presented it to a particular group of researchers that were already doing their own thing. They seemed interested, and the guy that we presented it to happened to mention, gee, I never thought of including quantitative jump in terms of participants as one of the variables. I don't think he ever carried it out, but I'm really interested in that just because it's something that we thought about doing, and it sounds like you actually did it.
We actually did. And when I was doing this with Buharich in the early 90s, before he passed, we measured water from a mikveh, ritual bath, as opposed to just normal tap water. And we measured someone wearing tefillin, which he postulated might put an 8 hertz field around the person. Because there was a lot of governmental stuff going on with the Russians and the Americans and the Israelis shooting destructive frequencies of ELF back and forth at each other. It was kind of like a quantum war going on. And he wanted to create a protective shield, as it were. And he found that tefillin did, not only when I wore it, because I could generate 8 hertz in a healing way, but we took a non-Jewish person who didn't know what it was about, put him inside Puharich's Faraday cage, and measured the field around him. And in fact, it did produce an 8 hertz bubble. And the hand model, which is modeled on some level after the tefillin shape and the wrapping around shape, actually produced that change in Puharich's lab. And then this recent experiment did it with intention. In other words, when we did it back then, there was no intention involved. He said, okay, go 8 hertz. And I just mentally began to do a remote healing while I was sitting there in the dark in this. You couldn't have electricity in the space or wires running to machines, because that was 60 hertz electricity, and that was outside of the range that we wanted. So we had to get rid of all of that. And it was really quite fascinating to see this jump. The person who was in there that we were targeting, who had a health problem, indicated that she felt a change. In other words, I had started myself, and then we kind of increased it a little bit, and then we jumped over 10 people. We had about a dozen or 13 that day. And she actually felt the change when she was sensitive enough to it to feel the exchange. So it was really kind of
and this
cool.
was with intention, that this was what
that was with the intention for healing.
So Stan would have wanted to incorporate the hand gestures into.
I have no doubt.
Yeah.
Well, it was.
Go ahead.
It was, to be fair. We started out with a bet, a resh, and a chaf, the 3 letters of the word baruch, the 3 root letters of the word bless. And that's part of the meditation that we're doing, inspired by Stan's stuff, as a prep before we go into the healing state.
To set your intention.
To get everybody's intention together.
Go ahead, Adele.
It's really interesting. You and I should talk about it.
Go ahead, Adele.
You're muted.
Unmute.
Thank you. My curiosity about the 10, that's why I made the dance for 10 dancers. I was curious to see if what Stan had written about community and just this sort of mystical power that 10 might produce. And I had done this pilot project with 8 dancers. And there was often, on occasion, there was friction in the room with just little things that happened. But it was very interesting when the cast was 10, we worked for a much more sustained period of time, really a year and a half. And there was never one moment of contention. Just everybody was willing to work out whatever confusions there were. People were helping each other, and the group really gelled as a very loving community, which was actually beyond my expectations. I was just trying to see what it would do in the dance studio. It moved past the dance studio to a really caring, loving group of people. So for me, even though it was subjective, there was nothing, no objective measures. It was just a sense that something magical did happen with this particular group of 10 dancers.
Which
I
is
just wanted to share that.
exactly, I think, what was being referred to in that quote from the RE, which unless I'm not remembering the video, I'm just associating these things in my head. But Bill, that was part of the yes, that was part of one of the quotes at the beginning of the video.
Right.
So it's like that exactly is, it sounds like, is what happened with your group of dancers. You formed a community.
It became a minion of dancers. But I was also curious about 10. There's so much mystical about 10, the 5 and 5 of our hands, that how I hadn't studied Sefer Yetzirah at that time, but the images of the hands with the mouth in between our hands, the covenant and the words and the boundaries that our hands create, and the 5 and the 5 and the 10, and all of the drawings that he made with triangles with 10, like a pyramid of 10. And I thought they were all conducive to movement. So we had a lot of triangular spatial shapes with our bodies. And of course, the spatial arrangement of the Sephirot is 10. And those were markers on the floor that became spatial patterns for the dancers in the most meditative section, where the music really was very powerful and the dance was very minimal and very introspective. And having the shape on the floor of the Sephirot was very powerful to be in the dance and experiencing that. So 10, it's a very mystical number. I'm sure Daniel has more to say
I
about
always
10.
wondered, with if we could have had our dreams fulfilled and done this experiment, I picture like kind of a Stanford lab research place where researchers are behind a one-way mirror or whatever, but it has to be kind of a pastoral, setting, just so the participants can get into the whole frame of mind, but finding 10 people who, I don't know how you do it, but have a kind of, maybe not a love for each other, but just a love for life in general, and know how to open their heart. And so you get 10 people. And then in terms of using the hand gestures, is there a specific, gestures that you're going to, and I could see this whole experiment being done. And then once it's done, seeing what the outcome of that is. Does it provide any solution to an issue, or does it heal somebody, if, for example? And then sitting each participant down and say, okay, how did this affect you? What did you feel? What was going on? That would be kind of the experiment I could see happening, utilizing what you guys were trying to achieve when Stan came up with this idea. And maybe that's a possibility. Yeah, Daniel.
It used to be there used to be, I know in Europe, Eastern Europe, there were like different kinds of minyanim. There are different kinds of quora of prayer groups, and they were according to the trade of different people. So the tailors had their own prayer group, and the bookbinders had their own prayer group, etc. And what's interesting about that is at least, you know, in this stage of human development, it's easier to love someone as yourself when you really have a lot in common. And I think that there's really something to be said for that, starting out with people who really share a passion or some sort of particular group thing that they all have in common. It just lends itself to an openness that can be, I think can be really transcendent. It's just an idea, you know.
There seems to be enough data to back this up, you know, in terms of from various sources. But this is a unique kind of experiment because nobody else has developed hand gestures with that have meaning, and it would be an interesting, you know, way to go. Adele, you've come the closest, I guess, to achieving that, and perhaps if you do it again, maybe you could carry it a little further in terms of seeing what the reactions are, and perhaps you did already get reactions from the participants.
There's a form in dance called flocking, and it's an improvisational score. And Deborah Marcus and I co-taught at Lamud Festival that summer that Daniel and I also co-taught. And in our class, we used flocking as a way to unify the group. And I used it again when I was teaching in Philadelphia recently in early July. And I used it with the letter Resh because Resh is also head, and a little bit of follow the leader, you know, who is the head of the group and how does that change as the group turns. And it was, again, equally remarkable moment when the group was improvising and anyone walking in the door would have seen unison of connection. They might not have seen exact unison of movement, especially with various abilities in the room, but the connection as the focus turned and a new person became the leader, the flocking was very exciting to see. And I just needed a different kind of movement quality for each of the letters we were working with. So I think flocking with 10, I've done in classes that I've taught, where you start with 4 and more people enter the circle of dancers and continue. New leaders show as the focus of the circle turns. So there's a lot to play with in movement. Yeah, so
What
the
you were
experimenting
saying,
isn't over.
what we're
many
saying about the individuals, it wasn't an exact copy, but there was obvious coordination. That's exactly what's happening with the birds and the fish, because there's the way it works, the research mathematically, there is a particular range surrounding each creature.
Yes.
That, they go, I can't be farther away than X and I can't be closer than Y. But anything within that range, they can do and be whatever there are. And if there are, since there are creatures on all sides of them, they're coordinating in a sense, they're coordinating in a sphere that, has both an external boundary and an internal boundary. And then there's the creature in the middle of that. So that, what you just said about your dancers sounds exactly like that. There's a coordination that you can see when you pay attention to the group as a whole, which is greater, or, it's more, it's not the same as the sum of its parts. Let's just put it that way. Because the sum of its parts, each individual is doing what they can within their own physical capacity.
Yes.
But then again, there's what happens when they're all doing that with the same idea. I get it. This is just wonderful.
Yeah, and it's all
beautiful.
about the flocking. It's amazing that you were using that term, and that's what Stan was going for. Flocking and the swarming. especially with the bees. We have an article about Devora the beekeeper. I mean, the motivation is to find food. I mean, that's why they're doing it, but nature is forcing them to do it this way because that's the natural way, it seems. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the most recent research on murmurations of the starlings, which is thousands of birds that swoop and turn seemingly together, that it's any one bird is relating to 7 to 10 other birds. And I think 7 is actually the maybe the tipping point of relationship, that they, when they did slow motion photography to see it. So that's why it looks like they're together, but it's a relay, because within the 7, one of those 7 is also relating to the next 7, and one of those 7 is relating to the next 7. So 7 to 10 creates this wave. And I don't know if they've been able to do slow motion photography of fish or the bees to see exactly what that turning point number is, but it is fascinating that that's the result is actually the shape of what's in our hand. It's a spiral shape, and they're not necessarily looking for food. They're actually protecting themselves against a predator. So many times the murmuration begins when there's a larger bird or an animal that's threatening. And so by having this swarm, they're all protecting each other. And
Yeah, I was just talking about the bees. That's what
the
I
bees is for
mean.
food. Yeah.
Now, by the way, there are videos on YouTube that do show that there are the angles and all that. People have done this research, so it's readily available, having to do with the waggle dance. We want to get into this more. We run out of time today, but we're going to be going through a couple of articles that were written on eTours on our website, having to do with flocking and swarming with bees and other animals and birds. So yeah, stay tuned, and we'll be doing that again next time. But for now, we have to say thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.